Well, hello there. Welcome to the Dungeon of Zen. In today's video, we'll be taking a quick break from my usual session prep content to introduce a brand new crafting project that'll be coming down the pipe in the next few months. If you've seen any of my prior videos, you are surely familiar with my overland terrain tiles that I built about a year ago in preparation for my brand new campaign, The Blight of Novaron. They have been a wonderful addition to my terrain kit, and they offer a variety of options and modularity while we're playing the game at the table. But there's one thing that these terrain tiles certainly are not. They're not Underdark tiles. Welcome back. Now, I do apologize if the thumbnail was a bit misleading and you were actually expecting me to craft these particular tiles, but I actually built these about a year ago, well before this channel was even a thought in my mind. And the Underdark tiles are still in the planning phase, hence this particular video. I plan to release a series of short form videos over on my Instagram, which I should probably think about creating one of these days, as well as here in YouTube, documenting the process by which I create those Underdark tiles. And of course, I will put together a much more thorough and detailed tutorial video here on YouTube once everything is complete. Unfortunately, I don't yet have an update on when those videos will release, as of the time of filming right now, I haven't even bought the foam yet, and I'm going to be using a full 4x8 sheet of foam board, but I'm sure my future self while editing will add some sort of update down below. But before we head down to the table to start designing our brand new Underdark dungeon tiles, let's take a moment to discuss the design philosophy behind creating modular tiles to begin with. Now, it should be noted that you absolutely positively do not need terrain tiles of this particular quality to enjoy Dungeons & Dragons or any TTRPG. You don't need tiles of any quality to enjoy Dungeons & Dragons or any TTRPG. However, I've always been the kind of person that needs to fidget while doing anything mundane like watching TV. My fingers need to be occupied doing anything, something, which is why I often paint miniatures and craft terrain while I watch TV with my wife at home. And that said, while I do love crafting, it also should be noted that crafting terrain tiles like this is likely the most complex way of going about it. If you watch wargaming channels, you'll probably see large full terrain boards that are used for skirmish games, and those work absolutely fantastic if you're doing those repeated skirmishes for games like Warhammer 40k or just Warhammer in general. And you could also just buy a battle map if you wanted to and place some key scatter terrain all over it. I have done that. And they even sell these really cool canvas battle maps now where you can place books and other heavy objects under the mat to create terrain and elevation, and then also join it with some scatter terrain for a really immersive play experience. And of course, I could always just buy a really high resolution JPEG image and insert it into my fancy Fantasy Grounds VTT and let my players experience a truly comprehensive battle map in full HD. We could even play Theater of the Mind if we want to. But none of that is going to satisfy my itch to craft something, nor will it flesh out a YouTube channel like this. So instead, we're going to be building more tiles. Again, it's always worth noting that I'm very rarely reinventing the wheel here on YouTube. There are plenty of other channels dedicated solely to crafting, and they craft far better things than I could ever craft. But I have learned quite a bit from those channels, and I've also developed quite a bit of experience myself crafting my own tiles, so I think I've got some really exciting things to show you once we get started. However, with that in mind, it's important that we establish a series of directives for us to follow while designing these tiles and then also crafting them to make sure we accomplish our desired goals. Otherwise, we run the risk of overcrafting, undercrafting, or quickly becoming overwhelmed. That happens very easily. Therefore, I've thought through 5 pillars of work that I'll have to keep in mind throughout the design and build process to prop up our activities. Pillar number 1 is quite simply tile size. It's pretty self-evident that when using terrain at the table that we have to be cognizant of space. This isn't an issue when using a digital photograph for a VTT, unless your computer is so ancient it can't handle big file sizes. But when we're crafting, we have to make sure that the tiles that we are going to be creating will all combine to a size that will fit our play space. And me personally, I'm working with a play space that's 4 feet by 4 feet, and I will be crafting 16 12 by 12 inch boards to fill that play space. The second pillar is that of modularity, by which I mean that it's important that while we're designing these tiles, that they all will match up and meet together in a consistent way while shifting your tiles in various configurations. There's something that I tried with these woodland tiles, but the roads, the way I have them centered here, or actually they're a little bit off center, they didn't quite work in certain configurations. So instead of resulting in all of my tiles being able to connect in various ways, only a few of them were. So it's really important that I challenge myself to perfect this seamless configuration integration with these Underdark tiles. Our third pillar is detail. The Underdark is a lush and vibrant environment, and there is no shortage of source material to find online. There was even the recent Baldur's Gate 3 video game which showcased the Underdark quite thoroughly, and while I do not want to entirely outright steal that design palette, my players are very familiar with the game, and using it as inspiration will really help draw them in and sell what it is I'm trying to show them. It'll also help inspire some of the little details that I hope to create with 3D printed terrain bits, water effects, and of course, LED lights, which I've heard often makes videos very popular because everybody loves LED lights. So of course, LED lights everywhere. Just kidding. The fourth and penultimate pillar is verticality. Going back to all that inspirational art that's out there, there's hardly an image online that doesn't showcase the Underdark with verticality and elevation, which makes total sense considering the Underdark, in those large spaces at least, are giant cavernous domes. So of course there'll be elevation. My goal was to create a series of snaking paths that change elevation from board to board and terminate at a central spire that rises up into the dome of the cavern, because that dome or that spire is the only way to get to the next story up where the big bad evil guy's city is, at least in my campaign. So all that verticality will be fun to craft, and it'll result in a number of dead ends, sheer drops, and will leave some space for some parkour action. But I have to be rather thoughtful about how I do this because it all leads into my fifth and final pillar, which is the lamest pillar, storage. For me personally, storage isn't too much of an issue since I play in my garage and that's where most of my stuff ends up. Thankfully, my wife doesn't care too much about the garage, although she does have this strange idea that garages are meant for cars or something. I don't fully understand it. She and I also dumbly volunteered to organize and run our son's Cub Scout popcorn sale this year. So while that's pretty annoying, at least we have no shortage of boxes to store all this stuff in. With that storage, we'll have to be careful with those elevated pieces, perhaps making some of them detachable so that we don't run the risk of destroying them while transporting or simply storing them. But that's enough talky talk for now. We've got our 5 pillars, we've got an idea in mind. Let's head on down to the table and see what I'm cooking up for my players this time. All right, welcome to the table. Please excuse me as I adjust my pencils. It's very important that they are right where I want them. I also hope this style of video works out pretty well. I recorded this footage the other day and now I'm doing a recording over it. We'll see how it goes. I will of course speed things up and slow things down as necessary to make sure this video is nice and snappy, but we'll see how it goes. Please let me know if it works for you and I'll of course adjust as needed. All right, so here I am putting in a little legend, a little key for my diagram. This way, both you and myself know what all of the little things are that I will be putting on this diagram are going to be. There will be open pits like chasms, crevasses, that kind of thing. There will be stalagmites. Most of these will be the ones that connect with their stalactite brethren in the ceiling. There will be flora, there will be fauna, there will be crystals, there will be fungi, there will be pathways that come to a jagged, abrupt halt, there will be water effects, and there will also be ramps, although I failed to put the ramp symbol in my key. I'll go ahead and do that later for the actual build. So you may notice that central white area down the center of the page. I actually had to tear out 2 of my precious pieces of paper from my journal to create this diagram because I wanted to make sure the scale was as close to 1:1 as possible. I didn't want there to be too much wiggle room. I wanted what I draw here to be representative of what I will put on the board itself once it comes time to the build. So I had to cut out these pages, tape them together, and make sure the grid was nice and neat and orderly. And sadly, I actually wasted 2 other pages because I spilled water on them when carrying them downstairs. Classic, I still haven't gotten over it. Okay, so here you see me counting in from the edges 5. This is because every 5 inches is where a pathway piece has to end. I'll measure in 5 dots from the right and 5 dots from the left, resulting in a 2-dot pathway at the edges, at the seams. This will mean that the paths will always be 10 feet wide for the players while playing at the edges. This should allow all the boards to line up in a nice, even, straight configuration no matter what orientation they're facing. And I will also have to worry about the elevation of the pathways as well come time to build. Because this is a 2D schematic, I can't exactly see the third dimension, the elevation dimension. So I will probably have to ensure that all of the pathway pieces are at the same height and perhaps add some detachable pieces to generate more varied heights when going between the tiles. Again, that's the kind of thing that I need to figure out at the build table. It's hard for me to pre-plan those things, but I'm pretty confident I'll figure something out. All right, here's where you can see me adding those little ramp symbols. This will connect to the ground floor of the tile. Okay, I think in a few seconds here, I'm going to go ahead and speed up the video. I just spend quite a bit of time counting dots and making sure all of my pathways line up and look interesting and varied. The whole point here is to create varied and interesting pathways that'll allow the players to get to their chosen destination in whichever way they want. They're going to start down there in the bottom right hand corner, and they're going to need to get all the way to the upper left hand corner. Pretty soon I will add a grid designation system to this diagram, A through D along the vertical axis and 1 through 4 along the horizontal axis. And at some point I'm going to create an encounter table which will be keyed to each of those grid designators, much like a hex crawl, but that will be its own video. All right, here's where I start drawing out the central spire. I use that term completely misleadingly because the spire is in fact not central to this board. It isn't central to anything. You might be asking, if this is your encounter board, why wouldn't your players just walk off the tiles and go around everything that you've pre-prepared? Well, we're kind of lucky that these are Underdark tiles and that in the Underdark, everything is surrounded by cavernous walls. So I'll simply explain that if you go off the grid, you're basically getting up against one of the walls that goes up into the ceiling and creates the dome. Is this fair? No. Do I care? Also no. It works and it does make some sense with the narrative. But again, like I've mentioned before, my players are pretty reasonable. They understand that there are limits to this whole process and that they were more than welcome to play along and just have fun with what I've prepared for them instead of challenging me at every turn. If I tell them that if they go off the grid, they're more or less hitting the walls of the cavern, they'll understand and stick to the beaten path. Okay, here's where we're adding our very first terrain and or landmark piece, a water feature. It's just a rather large lake that is being filled by a overhead waterfall coming out of the ceiling. There's a giant crack in the ceiling of the dome and water is just pouring forth from it. I haven't decided if this lake is going to be made out of poison or the pink blight, or if it'll simply be a water source in general, or what creatures exist in here, if any at all, but that will be a future me problem. Here you can see the waterfall coming out of the ceiling. This is how I can kind of justify that hard, sharp, abrupt ending to the pond and not the organic nature of it, as you can see with the rest of the pond. I made sure to count my dots to ensure that if I turn both of these tiles 45 degrees, that they can jut together in that configuration as well, and we could have a longer water piece than we have here. I also like how the ramp parts will be going over the water itself. It'll be a challenging build at the crafting table, but I think it'll look really cool and add some nice three-dimensionality to it when you can see the pathways kind of looming over the water itself. Over here in this grid is the first of our man-made landmarks. It's a simple temple of some kind that's half buried. Whether or not the players come over here or not is up to them, but it again adds a lot of versatility to the board, because if they come over here and want to explore it, they can do so. It'll link to another side quest of some kind. If they choose to ignore it, it just makes the table look aesthetic and pleasing and offers some verisimilitude, and I can always reuse this tile down the road for not even just an Underdark session, but any kind of game that requires some sort of half-buried temple. Okay, please excuse my hat here. I think I was leaning in because I was finding myself completely incapable of drawing a straight line here. Despite the grid system that would have helped do that, I was completely failing in that task. I don't know why, but it really bugged me, and eventually I just moved on because it bugged me so much. I didn't even bother to fix it. Well, I fixed it a little bit, but not too much. So it's worth noting that I have no idea what this temple structure will eventually look like. It may be a pyramid, it may be a ziggurat, it may just be a half-buried chunk of real estate, I don't know. This little square symbol is just a designator to know that that is where something is. Here's my grid system like I mentioned, but more on that at a later date. And here I'm putting a gigantic skull in the ground. I saw this in one of those location art inspiration pieces that I found online. I thought it looked really cool. I'll be able to find some sort of STL file and 3D print a skull that's already kind of cut off at the bottom to imply it being buried. And here we are drawing out the spires. I have one spire here in A1 and there's going to be another one in A2. For those of you who don't know, elevation lines are used to designate how tall and steep something is. The more lines there are, the taller it is, and the closer the lines are together, the steeper the angle is. So you'll see me create this secondary spire to be pretty steep and pretty tall, but once I go back over to A1, I'm going to make that really steep, really tall, connecting all the way to the ceiling. And here I'm just drawing in a little structure. I haven't quite decided what this will be, some sort of guard outpost that will protect the spire from entry by intruders. So the rest of this video is me mainly just adding in some of the terrain features, the open pits, the stalagmites, the flora, the fauna, and the crystals. This little section over here in C1 and C2 is a broken Badland type chasm where players that venture in this area will run the risk of falling into these bottomless pits and suffering a fate worse than death. Perhaps they will simply just fall forever and never end up anywhere. Who knows? The Underdark is quite chaotic. At the very least, they'll simply fall to their death, which is pretty fun. I'll probably put some sort of encounter over here, like a drow ambush coming through here as well. It'll make for a pretty interesting fight environment. You'll see that I try to at least put some of these chasms all over the place, kind of randomly, but in a way so that if I orient these tiles in various configurations so they don't abruptly show up, there will be some seamless integration between the terrain features. Obviously, C1 and C2 are where the majority of these open crevasses are, but I can always butt it up against other tiles and there will be some open crevasses as well, therefore allowing some seamlessness to the tiles. I'm also adding in the stalagmites right here. Again, this is not entirely necessary for my planning purposes, but as you see in a little bit, areas B1, B2, and A2 are kind of a heavy concentration of these stalagmites, and that is because the drow had built in this area because they could use those stalagmites as a defensive posture. It'll block line of sight from the ramps, meaning that players can't just sit back and cherry pick the guards. They'll have to get close, they'll have to be smart, they'll have to move around. Now this spire over here in A4 will be one of the larger of the spires, but still not one that allows them access to the city above. It'll be surrounded by flora, fauna, and fungi, and will likely be some sort of myconid colony, very much like Baldur's Gate 3. Again, I'm not totally sure what kind of encounter will be placed there, but it will be a place that maybe the party can find some shelter, maybe they'll find some dangerous creatures there. Again, we'll see. That part of this whole process will come later. Thankfully, I should have something like 6 months to prepare these tiles, although I guess my players could go to the Underdark in the next session and then I'll be totally screwed. But again, like everything else, we'll deal with that when we have to. Here's my little symbol for the fungus, just some double Pac-Man symbols. It's just enough to make me remember to put more of this stuff here than everywhere else. This is probably where I'll use a lot of LED lights for those mushroom caps and the flowers. Again, more on that as we get to it. Now, as we close out the video and I put down some more flora, some more fauna, some more fungus, and I add a little crystal cluster over there in D1, I'm just thinking through the release structure for the videos. I'll of course release this video as soon as possible, and then when I get the foam to start crafting, I think the very first video I create will be me transcribing all of this doodly-doo to the board itself, as well as Mod Podging it and coloring the initial structure and cutting it all out. When I created my overland terrain tiles, I actually had it as one big board and then I cut it into chunks using my table saw, which worked really well, but I did not account for the kerf of the blade. But I'm thinking right now that I'll just go board by board, showcasing how I create each one independently of each other and then release small videos in that vein. Alright, I guess I'll give you one quick preview for one of the encounters I have thinking. Over here in tile C4, that really large, high terrain path, I'm thinking we put a classic roper, a wonderful creature to grapple and throw people all over the place. Maybe some of these players will end up in that pool, some of them will end up slamming against the cavern walls. Regardless, this will be a fun little encounter that should slow them down and give them something to worry about. Alright, that's about it for this video. Please like and subscribe and all that. If you have any suggestions for other things that I can put along this terrain board, please leave those down below. I'll happily take any and all suggestions out there. I think this board will look pretty similar once we actually get down to it. I think I did a pretty good job organizing and varying all the terrain features. But again, I'm always happy to add more. So I guess that's it for now. Until next time, I'll be seeing you.